Hey, this is four-time Black Belt World Champion Dominica Obelenite. If you guys are looking to level up your Jiu-Jitsu game with awesome Jiu-Jitsu courses on mindset, strategy, and beyond, make sure that you guys check out BJJ Mental Models Premium. I myself have a course up there, so make sure you guys check it out. Let's get you guys on that next step in your Jiu-Jitsu journey.
Hey, welcome to BJJ Mental Models, episode 239. I'm Steve Kwan. BJJ Mental Models is your guide to a conceptual and intelligent jiu-jitsu approach. And today, this is a coast-to-coast call. I'm here on the West Coast, and I believe my guest is over on the East Coast. Happy to be joined by Mr. Greg Sirico. How's it going, Greg?
Pretty good. How are you, Steve?
I am also doing well. Looking forward to just having this recording to cap off the week. And it's funny, you've been a community member and a person I've known for quite a while, but this is, I think, as we said, the first time we've ever actually spoken like human beings as opposed to text, right?
That is correct.
So we've got a lot of mutual contacts, and I'm guessing that probably a lot of people in our audience are familiar with you already, but just in case, why don't you give yourself a quick introduction?
Sure. So my name is Greg Sirico. I own Odyssey Jiu-Jitsu here in Atlanta, Georgia. I'm a black belt under Marcelo Garcia. And one of the black belts that works at my academy is someone that you are somewhat familiar with. His name is Brandon Bennett. He is the black belt under who gave Robert Deagle his black belt. So a little bit of connection there.
Small world for sure.
Very small world, right? The jiu-jitsu world is very, very small. And then when you realize how small that is, it's really weird.
Yeah, it definitely is. Well, hey, on that note, let's talk about Odyssey Jiu-Jitsu here. One of the reasons I wanted to have you on, the suggested topic we were going to discuss was something near and dear to my heart, which is jiu-jitsu careers for regular people. I think everyone, when they think of jiu-jitsu careers, they think of top-tier competitors who go off and make tons of instructionals. But the vast majority of the sport, as we say on the podcast, is just regular folks. And it is possible to make a career out of this. I know a lot of people, they're in the back of their mind, their dream is, man, I'd love to quit my day job and do jiu-jitsu full-time every day. It absolutely can be done. You're someone who I believe has done it. So why don't you tell me your story? Tell me a little bit about how you got where you are today.
Sure. So the story goes back to when I was living and training in New York. And I always had a dream to open up an academy and run my own program. And I knew that would be very difficult in New York for a variety of reasons. One of them being the economics of opening any type of business in New York is very, very difficult. So whether that's the capital upfront cost, whether that's the maintenance of the program, or even just the staff you're going to have to hire and what you have to pay them. So that entire outlook just, made me say, not possible here, but if I can find somewhere where the cost of living is a little bit cheaper, possibly in an area that could use more jiu-jitsu, and I believe most cities can anyway, so that's a whole other story. But I looked at different markets and I said, where could I possibly do that one day? And I always kept my eyes open. And a couple of years ago, my wife got a job opportunity in Atlanta, Georgia. And so we came down here and kind of experienced what it would be like living in Atlanta, Georgia. We were very pleased for a variety of reasons outside of the opening a facility here one day. But that was kind of the spark. And then it kind of put a message in my head like, okay, I can possibly do this if I structure everything correctly. And then once we moved down here, I started thinking to myself like, okay, if I'm going to run a program, what is that going to look like? Where am I going to go in the city? What kind of jiu-jitsu is currently here? And I did some deep analysis on that as well. And, eventually opened up the academy I have. And now I've got about 215 students in 3 years, or 3 to 4 years. So that's a pretty good growth. We've got a thriving adults program. We've got a up and coming kids program. So that's kind of been something we're working on. But our adults program is pretty good. And we've got multiple classes a day. We've got class at 6 o'clock in the morning, classes at noon, kids classes around 5 o'clock. Adults at 6, 7, open mats at 8, weekend classes, weekend open mats. We do tons of seminars. So we are pretty busy.
Nice, man. Well, that sounds amazing. I got to ask you, was the location the key variable in choosing where you wound up opening this? Because it sounds like you're sort of implying if you were staying in New York, it just never would have been feasible. Or do you think that if you stayed in New York, you would have one day wound up doing the same thing anyway?
I think if I stayed in New York, I probably wouldn't have this opportunity, if I'm being completely honest with myself. I think that it would have always been something in the back of my mind that possibly I could do with the right connections and maybe with a couple of business partners and, maybe an angel investor or something like that. But I think it would have struggled. I think that, and not because I can't teach or anything like that, but simply because of the economics of New York City. It just makes it very difficult for new business. It's really, really hard to get off the ground because you need tons of capital up front. And that's with any business. So when you look at a city like New York and you realize that New York City has, a multiplier, that's insane versus most other cities in the United States, you realize that not only do I need that more upfront capital, but there's also a lot of risk there as well. Where you can go somewhere else where, I wouldn't say a second or tertiary market, but something like in Atlanta, Georgia. Other markets you could think of in the United States are like a Charlotte, North Carolina, Charleston, South Carolina. Those are other markets that are emerging. Look at what happened in Austin over the last, decade. You've got cities in Florida that could probably use more jiu-jitsu. I would even argue that Nashville has kind of grown a lot lately, even in the jiu-jitsu scene. And it's, a thriving place if you wanted to open an academy there. So there are definitely markets in the South that are really viable for someone who wants to open an academy. I think there's been a lot of migration post-COVID from people who have lived in, a Boston or a Chicago or a New York or an LA, where they realize the cost of living, as much as they love living there, the cost of living is just so high that they realize they can move to a city that's emerging and realize that they can have a good quality of life and put a good product out there and have a good shot at success.
Yeah. What's interesting? I live out here on the West Coast in Vancouver, BC, Canada. And I am always shocked by how many jiu-jitsu gyms we have out here and how many seem to, at least at surface level, be running successful for the reasons you brought up. Vancouver is a very high cost of living city, and the wages here are not amazing by any stretch. And so I'd always assumed, man, they say that 90-something% of businesses fail within the first few years. I always assumed that running a jiu-jitsu gym in our area would be just an absolute nightmare. But I got to say, I know most of the people out here who own these gyms, and it seems like the success rate is shockingly high. And again, as you pointed out, of course, you're going to worry about, is the market oversaturated? But I don't know if there's a cap out point that we've hit yet, at least here in Vancouver. It seems like there's a gym on every freaking street. And for whatever reason, that doesn't seem to be an obstacle. It never seems to hit that point of being oversaturated. I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on, for academy owners, the future and the growth of the business. Do you think that academy owners need to be worried about oversaturation at some point, or are we still so far away from the growth ceiling of the sport that is not even worth thinking about?
Oh, I don't think we've even touched the tip of the iceberg, to be honest with you. If you think about it, we're really just shooting from the hip here numbers-wise, but how many people do jiu-jitsu in the United States? It's like a fraction of a percent. It's probably something like that. And if you think about how many people that when they get introduced to it, like even if they don't do it for the long term, how many people when they get introduced to it, at least started at some point and kind of play around with it a little bit, right? So I think the reason why there's not a good cap on it yet in terms of its reach is simply because of its education process. I've always said that the biggest problem in jiu-jitsu in terms from a business is not what it is or how to run it. It's actually a pretty easy business if you think about it. The business model is not that difficult. What is difficult is the education process on your clientele, your prospects that walk in the door, right? Like that's the hardest thing, is to educate people on what is jiu-jitsu, whether that's through a digital ad or whether that's through an in-person conversation or a class or whatever means and methods you're using to introduce jiu-jitsu to your potential client, right? Your customer. That education process is something I don't think anyone's really hammered well. Like some people have done some things to help, but I don't think anyone's really nailed it yet. And I think that the person who does that and is able to articulate and explain what jiu-jitsu is to a mass amount of people is going to see a huge influx of people in their gym. So no, I don't think that there's even, I think most cities, even New York, there's 100 academies and gyms in New York, and what is there, 8 million people? That's just like being kind. When you conclude some of the suburbs and stuff, you're looking at 15, 20, 18, I don't even know. It's a stupid amount. So yeah, there's no cap on jiu-jitsu at this point. I don't think we've even we're not even scratching the surface on it.
Now, something interesting that you brought up just now was this notion that there are things that you can do as a jiu-jitsu gym owner to differentiate yourself and to be unique and to find a niche something that I think a lot of gym owners don't really put a lot of thought into. You know, they kind of just think, hey, I like jiu-jitsu. I know jiu-jitsu. I want to make a career out of jiu-jitsu. So I'm just going to open a gym and I'm just going to pick 3 random techniques every day and show them to my students. And I think that, of course, if you want to be successful, you have to have a better understanding of your kind of your identity and what makes you unique and valuable. Always an exercise that gym owners should probably go through before they start opening up a space. What are your thoughts on that? Is that a process that you had to go through yourself? And I'm just wondering if you've got any guidance for other potential business owners out there who might be planning to go down the same road.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think when you're thinking about opening up any business, right, whether that's jiu-jitsu or something else, you know, what is your differentiating factor? Like, what separates you from the pack, right? At the end of the day, if you're going to compete with another academy across the street, another school across the street, you know, what separates you from them? What is your competitive advantage? That is very important in any business model, right? I mean, Starbucks had a competitive advantage about, you know, the fact that their system was so clean and you can get your coffee really fast. We can talk all day about the quality of the product, but that's a whole different story, right? They're banking on certain things. So I think that if you understand your competitive advantage, you can really hammer on that. And I think that some academies should, you know, lean into that a little bit more, not just try to copy what the next person does, but think to yourself, okay, they're doing this. This part of that, of what they do works with what I want to do. What doesn't work? Take what works and discard what doesn't work for your own business. And on top of that, think about what you do well. And over time, you get to reevaluate that. I'm not saying that you should have a process and stick to it, you know, thick and through, but you should always kind of go through these iterations of what's working and what's not. How do I, you know, kind of reevaluate what I'm doing and improve on it? But you should definitely look at what works. For example, in my academy, at least in here in Atlanta, Georgia, there's not a lot of no-gi jiu-jitsu. There's one 10th Planet gym. There's a bunch of other traditional gyms that do mostly gi work, very little no-gi. And so to me, I thought to myself, like, okay, I come from Marcelo's, and at our gym, it was a 50-50 split, which I enjoyed. I liked having a diversity in jiu-jitsu. And I also kind of feel like there's a vast majority of the concepts and techniques that overlay between the two. So really to think they're two completely different, you know, arts is silly. There are differentiating things, but to think that they're, you know, one is apples and one's oranges, that's not exactly true either. So I wanted to open an academy that catered to both and provided both for people. And it also happened to work that the only teachers in my academy, Brandon Bennett, is also, you know, very big on no-gi anyway. So it kind of worked out that way. So I lean very heavily into that. When I talk to people, I let them know how robust our no-gi program is, how many no-gi classes we have. I'll showcase a lot of no-gi videos or no-gi classes in our Instagram. So I lean very heavily into the things that separate us from the crowd.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense too. And, you know, it's funny. I think a lot of people have it in their heads that to be a successful business owner in jiu-jitsu, you have to be a multi-time world champion with 300,000 Instagram followers. But again, the vast majority of people who are ever going to do it in this sport are going to be people who do it for fun or for a hobby, right? If you are only planning to target potential world champions as your customers, then you're going to find a very, very small customer base. There are a lot of broke-ass world champions out there who have not been able to build successful businesses. And the ones who have succeeded have done so by targeting a broader audience that they can actually monetize. So I think that's something that a lot of people need to overcome, which is this fear that I'm just not good enough at jiu-jitsu. You hear this all the time, right? Where people think, well, I don't know if I'm good enough at jiu-jitsu to open a gym. I mean, it turns out that your competitive record is actually not that critical to how good you're going to be at running a business and teaching people. It's a very different skill set. So I think sometimes people get too much into their own heads and are afraid to try opening that business because they just don't think they have the resume. But I think they're underselling themselves. And I think more people would succeed in this if they actually gave it a shot than they would expect. Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, to piggyback off of that, you know, even though I've trained at Marcelo's for, 10 plus years, I can safely say that a big part of what I've learned is through Paul Schreiner. And, a lot of people don't, look at his competitive career, but I can tell you for sure is that man has taught me more about jiu-jitsu mechanics than a lot of other people I've come across. I could say the same for Brandon, who, works at my academy. I learn a lot from him and he works for me. So I think that sometimes you have to think to yourself, if you truly want to learn jiu-jitsu, think to yourself, not necessarily who is the best competitor, but who is the one that's going to explain jiu-jitsu to me the way I am going to learn. I think that's really important. Yeah, definitely. Now, here's something I want to ask you when it comes to making the decision to go into running a gym. This is probably the most common jiu-jitsu career path, right? It's really hard to make a lot of money in jiu-jitsu if you want to be a pro competitor. And for the vast majority of people, even people who are really good at jiu-jitsu, I would generally discourage them from relying on that as their primary means of making money. When it comes to making a gym, though, I think that your odds of success are a lot higher, but there are risks. And one of the main risks is just the sheer cost of getting things off the ground. It's an industry that has a lot of upfront costs that you have to pay. You have to pay the rent for the space, or you have to buy a space, but more likely you're going to rent or lease it. You have to get insurance. You have to buy all of the merch and the gear and the equipment. You probably have to renovate the gym. People, I think, look at those numbers and they can be very scary to get off the ground. I'm sure you had the exact same thought when you kind of scoped out what it's going to cost you to run this thing. What are your thoughts or suggestions for people who want to get going, but just they're worried about how much money it's going to take to get off the ground, and also worried about the fact that they're probably not going to be able to break even or turn a profit for quite some time?
That's a great question. That's twofold. There's a lot of layers to that. So let me start with the how to start. I think you want to start small. At least I did. So I actually, rented out a space within another space. So I subleased within another space. And I did that, strategically. I wanted to occupy a space in a prime location. So location to me was very important. So I wanted to have, it's a proximity based, business, right? So, people search for you, especially if they're brand new. They're not going to say, oh my God, there's this great academy and it's like, 50 miles away. Unless they've been doing jiu-jitsu for like several years and they're looking to upgrade themselves, and that's a whole other, pipeline that you're trying to hit. The vast majority of white belts that walk in the door, they're proximity based. They're going to be within a few miles of you. So finding yourself a good location is a critical component to this. And if you understand that that's the component, well, then don't overstretch yourself. Start small. So sublease within a small space, build your brand first, stay there and kind of stay small and be very, I would say stingy with your money. Don't overstretch yourself. So what is the most important thing you need at the beginning? Your mats, right? So you just invest in that. That's the thing that you're going to take with you, even if you go to upgrade your facility at some point. So having good mats or even a decent mat space is probably where most of your cash is going to be upfront cost. Then you have to think to yourself, okay, so if I'm going to rent this space out, how many years until I see, or how many months until I see some type of a profit? So you want to have a nice buffer there. And that is very individual based because it depends on many variables. What is your rent? What is your overhead of staffing, if you have any? What is your overhead of utilities? And, all those little things. So you want to have a nice buffer of cash before you go into this. So my suggestion would be, 1, save your cash and then make a strategic move. 2, find an investor that is willing to outlay this cost and maybe you cut them in on the business, which is another strategy. Or 3rd, you go into partnership with someone. So all 3 are viable. It just depends on how you want to carve that out yourself. But at the end of the day, starting small and expanding, I think is the better play if you're just trying to play the risk reward game. Now, there are people that go out and tell you, go get $100,000 loan and invest in the place and, like YOLO, right? Like just go crazy. Not saying that can't work. But for me, before I ever got into owning an academy, I was actually a financial analyst. So I like to try to be as strategic as I possibly can be. And so I didn't want to go that crazy. Having said that, now that our academy's at a specific point, I'm actually doing a lot of renovations at our current facility. So we've expanded our mats. We're actually adding a second mat room. We added a spring-loaded floor. We bought newer mats that are way nicer than our old ones. We are adding showers, a newer locker room, redid the bathroom. So we're definitely investing more capital now because I see the trend in how many students we've acquired and what these new renovations will do to possibly in 3 years, drive more people to the business. So I feel comfortable making this type of a risk. I wouldn't have done this at day one though.
Yeah. And that's a really interesting point about getting investors involved. What are your thoughts on doing that? Do you think that's a necessity? Because a lot of the gyms that I know, when I ask them about this, they tend to seem to prefer to bootstrap, which I understand, but maybe there is an argument to actually get someone to come in and invest in you and help you get off the ground. Do you think that's a worthwhile thing, or do you think there's a lot of, or potentially too many risks in taking that approach?
I would say having an investor is not a bad strategy. However, you have to understand, like anything else, that when you get into business with someone, whether that's an investor, a partnership, however you carve that out, you are getting into a quote unquote marriage with that person and everything about them. So my biggest fear about anybody partnering with someone is know everything about them. If they're going to invest, what is the return? Are they asking for cash? Are they literally just gifting this to you? That's a whole other question. You got to really dive deep into when someone gives you money, they're going to expect something out of return. They're going to. It could literally just be your time. So you have to really evaluate what's that risk reward for yourself. And there's no right formula for that because there's a lot of variables at play. But you definitely have to think to yourself, if having somebody come into my fold, if I'm getting money from them, what are they looking for? Are they looking for, like I said, a percentage later? Are they looking for ownership and stock, like in your company, and they want to be have some ownership? Do they, I don't know, want to just learn jiu-jitsu for you for free? I don't know. So you really have to kind of evaluate that on an individual basis. My personal opinion is I like to kind of stay away from that. And I tend to not want to ask for money from, different people. I'd rather kind of grind it through myself. And it's not because I want to be this like, I can do it myself, egotistical maniac. I think it's because in decisions I've made in my life where I've done something and I said to myself, I'm getting into a business relationship with this person and maybe it's not working out for whatever reason. And then now I'm kind of tied to that hip there. So I think to myself, you're going to get in business with someone, know everything about them. It's not just you guys liking jiu-jitsu together. It's everything about them. Do they have the bandwidth to do the business? Do they even have the right vision that you do? Do you guys get along other than training jiu-jitsu? I mean, there's so many layers to that. Like, and this is true for any business. When you get into business with someone, you should know that you're getting into business with everything about them. So if there's somebody that, for example, has a very busy family life, that's going to play into this 100%. If there's somebody that has 3 or 4 other jobs and they can't commit to a certain amount of bandwidth of time, well, then what is that in relationship? What are you getting? Are they giving you do they only own 5% of your business, but they're giving you a lot of cash, but you know that they're really owning a small part of this and they're just doing more for an investment standpoint? Maybe that's okay. But if they're giving you a lot of cash and they own like half the business and you say to yourself, but you can't really do any of the work that I'm doing, well, then, you have to reevaluate how that looks. So I think the long and short answer to this, Steve, is it really does depend. But for me, I always tend to err on the side of caution.
Yeah. I think that's a great piece of advice there. The thing about going into an investor relationship with someone is you really can't get rid of those people once they come on board unless they want to go. And that can make things very, very difficult. And the challenge is you might go into a relationship like this thinking, well, I've been friends with this person for 20 years and of course it's going to work out. But man, as soon as money's on the line, things change. You got to be very careful picking an investor for your business. And so I think that that's always a decision that you want to weigh very carefully, especially when you're getting off the ground, especially if it's something that you think you're going to depend on for your own livelihood. I mean, yes, there's certain things that you can only achieve if you get that capital up front, but it's also a big risk. And so I generally would say in an industry like this, it probably makes sense to try to bootstrap most of the time if that's an option. But that said, there are a lot of situations where an investor can help. Like you said, maybe they just want to train at the gym for free and they're willing to help out along the way. Maybe they're not going to want to be particularly involved. They just want to sit in the back and help out. That's great if that's the case. But again, sometimes you enter these relationships with people and they'll say and believe one thing when they join you, but then a year later, they might be singing a very different tune. And it's very hard to remove someone at that point if they've already invested in your business. So it's like getting married, right? It's a relationship that you have to put a lot of thought into before you're willing to make that commitment.
100%. I say a business relationship is a lot like a marriage. I completely agree. I think if you did want to receive cash from someone on the outside, one thing that I would suggest to people, I've thought about it at times, but I haven't done it per se, is that you could sell lifetime memberships to somebody. I think I don't know how many people that do that. I know it's probably a more niche kind of way of acquiring capital early, but there are people that have come along and say, I believed in you. You've been doing jiu-jitsu for 10, 20 years. I trust your business in terms of your ability to teach. You know what? I just want to be your student. Here, I'll give you this much of cash and I want a lifetime membership. So I think things like that can, give you some cash early. Maybe if you get 2 or 3 of those, you know what? That'll give you some mass. That'll give you some equipment. So, is it going to be everything? No. Could it give you a head start? Sure. Whenever you can get capital up front, I think that's a good thing. You can always also kind of like pre-build things, right? So you can if you're going to open your academy, let's say, argument's sake, like, January 1st, 2024, you can start the prep work in, once you have the facility kind of lined up and you're getting ready for it, several months ahead of time, start acquiring that capital. Hey, if you sign up now, you're going to get this rate, et cetera, things like that. So you can kind of start to try to build that pipeline earlier rather than say, I'm going to open the gym and I'm going to sit in front of that, studio all day long and hope people walk in. Like that's, you kind of want to prepare yourself a little strategic.
Yeah. That's a really good observation as well. Something that people, I think, definitely need to think about as they move down this path. There are other ways to get that initial upfront money in addition to lifetime memberships. If people are going to balk at that, you can always offer, grandfathered pricing. Tell people, look, if you're one of the first 100 customers who signs up, I will give you a lifetime permanent discount that other people won't get later on. You can also give people a good rate if they're willing to pay for the first year or two in advance. You do that a few times, you get 10 people to do that, and you probably have enough money to cover at least the mats, if not something else. So that kind of stuff does add up, and it can be very helpful. The other thing you can do that I've seen a lot of people do is rather than trying to build your own facility, you can find an existing martial arts gym and sublease out of there. So if someone is running a judo club, for example, and they've got some empty spots where they're not actually running any classes, you can say, hey, I want to open up a gym. Can I co-locate at this address? I'll pay you, a fee if you let me use your space. And then you've actually got a real business. And when it starts to grow to the point where you need your own facility, you've already got a customer base you can migrate. That can be a lot more helpful than just being paid to be an instructor at someone else's gym. At least this way you own the business and you own the student relationships. And when it's time to move and get your own mats, then you can go and do that too.
Yeah, that's exactly what I did. I actually subleased out of a powerlifting facility. So it's ironic that you mentioned that. That's exactly what I did. It wasn't a Taekwondo student or anything, but similar idea, right? Just different means and methods. But I did the same exact thing. I subleased out of a powerlifting gym. Eventually, I acquired more space within that footprint, and it got to a point where the original powerlifting gym is basically gone, and it's my academy now.
Nice. Now, what about qualifications? I think that we all know that being a black belt, it's really not that big a deal, honestly. And I know everyone who's listening to this and is not a black belt is going to say, well, Steve, it's easy for you to say that because you've got the black belt. And I know I'm coming from that position, but I can tell you, it's really not that big a deal. The day that you get your black belt, you're not going to magically become 10 times better at jiu-jitsu. Yeah. However, there is a customer perception that if you're not a black belt, you're not a master. Now, we know as old gray hairs in jiu-jitsu that that's all BS, right? Having a black belt doesn't really mean that much other than time spent for the most part. But that said, marketing does matter. And my question to you would be, what if someone wants to start a jiu-jitsu business, but they're not a black belt yet? Maybe they're not even close, right? Maybe they're a blue belt or a purple belt. What do you suggest there? Is that too early to start opening a gym, or is there a way that you can make that work?
I'll be honest, I do think that is a little too early. However, if you have long-term plans, you can make it work. I'll give you an example. So I have, and this is super controversial, and I really don't care, to be honest with you, but I have a few blue belts that actually teach some of my classes. And I can tell you right now that, there are people in jiu-jitsu who turn around to me and say, oh my God, I can't believe you're having a blue belt teach, a basic class. That's kind of crazy. The guy, Dan, who teaches my blue belt class, or my basic class, he's a blue belt. He does a fantastic job. He is really, really technical, and he studies a ton. I can say the same about, Aman, who's one of our brown belts, and he teaches in the morning. He's so dedicated to his craft. And yeah, brown belt is definitely higher than blue, but it's in that same vein of trying to invest in people early. I'll give you an example. Sometimes when you open up a business, you don't say to yourself, I think you open up a business and you want to find the right person for the right role. Right? You go through the qualifications. This person can do this job, and he's done it in the past, and I hire him. Right? But I can also tell you is that if I have two qualified people, qualifications mean the ability to teach, quote unquote, right? And I say to myself, okay, this person is a black belt and he's 40 something years old. And I got this really very talented, purple belt who's, 27, 28. And he wants to actually do this for his living. He's not just trying to make a couple of bucks. That to me is pretty enticing. I can cultivate that man in a certain way and over several years, get him to teach early. By the time he's a black belt, he's used to teaching. Even if I just have him do little private lessons and little intro lessons and have him run a basic class or something, I monitor him, you cultivate him, but like you groom them, but you understand you're doing that at an early age, and age meaning belt, right? And by the time they're black belt, they're already teaching very well. They're not thinking about how to teach anymore. They can articulate what they're doing very well. So you're priming them for success later on to open their own academy. Yeah. Is it hard to open it at a blue purple belt? I would say no. I mean, I would say yes, it's hard, and I wouldn't advise to do that. However, I would say if you're interested, then this is where you go and you find your local place, and or you talk to your instructor, your coach, and say, this is an aspiration I have. Would you mind helping me out? I've had a student recently that have said that to me. And I says, okay, great. I was like, you've expressed interest in owning your own academy one day. Perfect. So now I'm going to empower you and put you in certain roles and mentor you through that. And over the years, I'm going to watch you grow. And then I'm going to give you the tips and the guidelines of what I did to get where I was to where we are now and where we're going forward. So is it possible to own an academy at a blue or purple belt? Yeah. Well, I think the better strategy, if you really want to have success, is get yourself in teaching roles early and then really build that long-term strategy.
Yeah, I agree. So much of opening up your own business is having an existing clientele or connection list that you can bring with you. And if you already have teaching experience and people already have worked with you, they're going to be a lot more likely to want to train under you. I think that if you want to be a jiu-jitsu instructor and open your own gym, but you have no teaching experience, it's going to be real hard to do that, would be my thought.
Yeah, I completely agree. That's why when I look through my staff, I think to myself, or not think, but I ask them, like, what are your aspirations? And if they have teaching aspirations, then I try to empower those.
Yeah, definitely. Now, up until this point, we've talked almost exclusively about opening a gym. And that makes sense because that is the most common way in jiu-jitsu that people are going to monetize, right? By far. Mm-hmm. That's going to be the most likely way that people are going to be able to get off the ground and have a good deal of success. There are, however, other ways that you can go about this process. There absolutely are other ways you can do this. And I think it might be worth exploring those briefly as well. So, I mean, as an example of some other things that you could look at, you could be a content creator. You could make instructionals. You could be a pro competitor. You could do seminar tours. I mean, heck, you could even do a jiu-jitsu podcast. There's a lot of ways that you can attack this. However, I would say that for most people, opening a gym is probably the most consistent, most reliable way to build a job around this. But I would want to explore if you've got any thoughts on some of the other options. If someone doesn't want to open a gym, but they do ultimately want to make a go out of this as a career, what kind of options are on the table for them? And is there anything you would suggest?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think if you asked me this several years ago, I would say in a competitive sense, no thanks. I don't think it didn't make any sense. I have changed my thoughts on that. I do think that you can make a living in a competitive sense. Now, is it harder to hit that top tier? Sure. I do think we're trending in that direction where you're starting to see athletes that are really worth it paid. For all his controversy, Gordon Ryan has really set like the tone for that. Like he has provided a platform that you can model now and say, wow, I really can actually make money off jiu-jitsu as being a competitor. Does he make a lot of his money off his instructionals? Absolutely. But you wouldn't even know about it if he wasn't as good as he was. So there's that, right? So I do think the competitive nature of it, it's pushing better boundaries today. And I think the more popular it gets as a sport, you're definitely going to find more money there. So I wouldn't have said this actually 10 years ago. Like I said, if you rewind this, a decade ago, I'd say there's no way you can you literally compete just so you can get popular and own an academy. And that's it. But things have changed. The zeitgeist is way different today. So in today's market, you can be a really good competitor and actually make some money. I mean, the Rotolos have showed that, Mike Musumeci has showed that, Gordon has showed that, and this is only kind of like, the last few years. So where would it be in 10 years? I don't know. But I think that bucket has definitely expanded more than I thought it would.
Yeah, definitely. It has been a surprise. It's been heartening to see because for a long time, I would have told people, don't even try this to make a career out of being a jiu-jitsu competitor. At this point in time, I don't feel as strongly about that. I feel like there is a good chance that you might actually succeed at doing this if you're good at it. But I think there is still the issue that to be a professional competitor and get paid for it, you've got to be in the absolute tippy top, right? If you're in like the 80th percentile of jiu-jitsu competitors, it's probably going to be pretty hard, I think, to make a go out of this as a jiu-jitsu pro if you want to make your money out of competition. But if you are actually at the top, I mean, yeah, there are options now that might not have been there even just a few years ago.
Right. And I would even to add to that, and now you can look at jiu-jitsu in a very similar fashion that, soccer moms or lacrosse moms are kind of looking at their kids, right? It's like, I'm not saying that you have to make a career choice at 7 years old, but if you take your kid and you put them in jiu-jitsu at a very young age, and then before you know it, they're 16 years old, they're a 16-year-old blue belt been doing jiu-jitsu for 10 years. I mean, they're priming themselves for a good athletic career if they choose to move forward with that. That platform has completely changed. I don't know how long you started, but when I started, the good black belts were winning world titles in their 30s, right? And there's a reason for it. I mean, times have changed. It's not that way anymore. I'm not saying you can't. Like everyone, you're always going to come across your Isaac Doderlin story, which is amazing, right? But like you look at the guys, like the Tynan Dalpers of the world, the Kolabates are coming up, right? People that are starting jiu-jitsu very, very young, and they're becoming professional at a teen level. Just like you would any other like niche sport, like if you wanted to be a gymnast, if you wanted to be, and I mean niche in the sense of not a top, it's not professional baseball or hockey or football or basketball, right? I'm talking about like a niche sport that does have some, financial career to it. Olympic, judo is another one. You could talk about soccer is different, but like gymnastics is a good comparable to it. So it's something you start at a young age and that you could possibly do professionally in your late teens to early 20s, where you're a professional athlete. I think that is what I'm kind of seeing. I don't know if that makes any sense, but I think that the tide is turning in jiu-jitsu in that sense. The real stars of jiu-jitsu are actually being built in the kids class anymore, not in your 20s.
Yeah. That's a really, really interesting take. Now, going beyond that, what about the pro seminar circuit? There are a lot of people who make their living by doing jiu-jitsu seminars. Of course, I guess the side effect and the downside of taking that approach is that if you want to be a seminar pro, then you need to be always on the road. And so there's lifestyle implications about that. If you want to be at home a lot, if you've got family, it can be very hard to do that. If you hate travel, it's hard. It's very hard to make a business out of running seminars if you're always in the same spot, just because, if you're always in the same spot, people are probably going to be tired of hearing from you over and over and over again. But beyond that, it definitely is an option. It is possible. And I'd be curious to know what your thoughts are on that, on kind of being a pro seminar specialist.
That's an interesting one. I think that there are people who possibly could do that if you structure it correctly. So if you're somebody that doesn't mind, I hate saying it, but kind of like being a traveling road band and spending time on the road, yeah, you can make some money doing that. I think that's completely possible. Matter of fact, you can even do that just to spark your gym. I mean, the Mendez brothers did that, right? I mean, they after they stopped competing, they did a hard tour of a lot of seminars. Why? Raise capital. I mean, they'd get some investors as well, but they raised a pretty good amount of capital as well on top of that. And that helped spark their gym, right? So, sometimes you can do that. So you can preload these things in a lot of different ways. You can even say to yourself, I don't really want to do seminars forever, but you know what? I'll do it for 2 years. I'll put some capital aside and there's my cash to start my business. So there are definitely, there's a lot of, layers to this and there's a lot of ways these kind of intertwine, but I totally think you can make money doing seminars and pretty much being just a seminar specialist. It's just whether you want to commit to that lifestyle.
Yeah, absolutely. Makes a ton of sense. Now, I mean, I'm curious to get your thoughts here on other types of fringe businesses, like, being a pro instructional person. I'm going to tell you right now, very few people out there make significant money selling jiu-jitsu instructionals, but it's not impossible. I mean, you talked about Gordon, right? Gordon does it. Danaher does it. Lachlan does it. You absolutely can do it. What are your thoughts on that? And I ask this because for a lot of people, the idea of making instructionals is really appealing to them. I think not just because of the potential for making money, which I guess is there, but also because of what it says about you. I think many people look at having an instructional under their name kind of like they would look at being a published author, right? It's just something they want to be able to say that they did for resume purposes. What are your thoughts on getting into that?
I think the latter part is exactly right. I mean, if you're going to put out an instructional and it can be part of your overall look, your resume, so to speak, I think that's great. When it comes to doing instructionals, you have to think to yourself, is it something that I have a large reach for? So if you're somebody that has a very small reach, well, then you're kind of capped out at where you can pull your money from. also with instructionals, you have to think to yourself, is it material that's out there already? For the most part, I mean, I'm sure me and you could go on BJJ Fanatics and literally look up almost any position and find an instructional on it, right? So how do you differentiate yourself? We talked before about competitive advantages in a business model. Why isn't that true with content creation? So, why don't you create maybe like, to be completely honest, why doesn't somebody create an instructional that's not even about jiu-jitsu techniques, but is like, how do you build a good gym? What is a culture like? Like literally, like as stupid as it sounds, but like I haven't seen anybody do that. Or, how about one about how to, how to create a curriculum? How crazy is that? Like people want to start, I'm going to start an academy. Okay. What do you need? I need mats. What else? I got to teach techniques. All right. What's that going to look like? What do you mean? Where are you starting? And then you can't even like, sometimes you draw a blank for a second. It's like, I don't know, defensive positions. Which one? So maybe you can, create an instructional. I hate saying instructional. Sometimes that word gets really annoyed, but you can create some content, some media that will tell another instructor, okay, here's what you should focus on at the white belt level. Here's what I did, and I've had some success with it, right? So I think you can use that really, really well. I think that's something that hasn't been tested. Or like I said, how to create a gym culture. What is that like? Or, how to have a broader reach on your digital platform. I think those kind of things are interesting. Honestly, I think there should be more people that want to kind of go the Craig Jones route, and that's going to push jiu-jitsu to a bigger level. Be funny, be interesting. There's a lot of good technical content out there, but I do think that, sometimes you want to watch a video and say, that was funny. Mm-hmm. I personally like stuff like that. So I wish that you would think not necessarily about a technical part, although that is probably the vast majority of it. But I think if you're someone that is not as popular, or maybe you just want to put content out there, think to yourself, what do I do well? Don't think, okay, I'm just a teacher, I want to teach. Think to yourself, what do I do well? Maybe it's something as simple as the culture of my gym is fantastic. Why don't I tell people what that looks like?
Yeah. It's funny you bring that up. I feel like at this point, I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't point out that all of the things you just suggested, we actually have premium courses on all of those things on BJJ Mental Models Premium. I feel like I got to give the plug here. If you are a coach interested in getting better coaching resources, building a gym, or even defensive positions, which you talked about, we've made some amazing courses there on Premium. So it has been done. And I know we're not the only ones who have done this. So I don't want to say it's just us by any stretch, but absolutely, I agree with you that is underserved. Too much, I think, of the jiu-jitsu space is focused on technique, but there's a lot more to jiu-jitsu than just having razor sharp technique, right? And so I think it is a huge opportunity for coaches to differentiate themselves by attacking the money-making side of the sport.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's just another way to kind of look at, your revenue stream. Is there something that you do, or is something that you do well, plus something that is not provided out there, or there's not a lot, I shouldn't say not provided, obviously you do, but is it something that is widely out there? Think to yourself, if it isn't, okay, why is that? Is it because no one's done it well, or is it because no one's thought of it yet? So I do think that's a nice component.
Yeah. Now, I would ask though, when people make these instructionals, and again, I'm going to use Fanatics as an example, because when people think of jiu-jitsu instructionals, that tends to be where they think they're going. So when you're talking about something like that, do you think people should realistically expect that when you launch your first instructional on Fanatics, you're going to make a ton of money? Because from what I've heard, the common experience is unless you're in the very top tiny percentile, you're probably not going to make a lot. Fanatics probably isn't going to promote it for you. It might be something you can put on a resume, and might be something you can put on your website that you made this instructional. But beyond that, financially, do you think it makes a difference for most people to do this?
Probably not. That's a really good question, actually. I do like the way BJJ Fanatics kind of, out of all the platforms I have seen, they probably do the best job in terms of actually like, quote unquote, like taking care of the content creator. They actually do a pretty good job of that. So I got to give them a lot of credit for it. But having said that, it really does come to, they put the onus on you, which is a good thing, right? It should be that way. If you want to use their platform to sell your content, well, then if your content doesn't have a far reach, that's where it is, right? So you kind of look at them as the platform, and you can't really blame them or whatever. You just have to really have really good content. So before you put it out there, you should really think to yourself, where is my reach? Don't depend on them, depend on yourself, because they're not selling your product. They're just the platform that you're selling it through, right? So you can't think to yourself, BJJ Fanatics is selling my stuff. They have really it doesn't matter to them. What matters is they are the horsepower to kind of just put things around and, like push it in certain levels, but you still have to have the gas behind it. So you have to think to yourself, if I put my stuff on BJJ Fanatics, is it popular? Do I have a large reach? And you don't care about the money. You're just doing it for a clout, or you're just doing it for a resume builder, or just to even just sell to your students. That's fine.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I think you bring up that BJJ Fanatics, they are a platform marketplace. If you come onto there and you have an instructional you want to provide, there's a good chance they're going to let you publish it. I mean, they will let most people come on there if they've taken the time to put something together. But that said, there's a lot of instructionals on there, and they're not going to take all of those people and turn them into celebrities. Just by putting an instructional on there, that does not mean BJJ Fanatics is going to promote you and you're going to become a superstar overnight. You're going to have much better luck with them if you've already built up that reputation yourself and you come in there with that backing you. That also makes it more likely then that they will support you and promote you. If you come on there and you do have a big name or you do have a decent sized following, they're going to be more inclined to push you and to promote you, which is definitely what you want, right? So that is something to also consider when you're going to Fanatics, is that if you're going to create an instructional there, you don't want to think to yourself, well, these guys are going to make a star out of me. You want to be working independently to build up that reputation so that you're coming in there with some momentum, and Fanatics will be even more inclined and more motivated to promote you than they otherwise would have been.
That's correct.
Awesome. Now, I mean, hey, on the topic of social media, I know that that's not, your forte necessarily. You're not like a professional jiu-jitsu content creator. I can definitely weigh in on this a little bit because that's kind of the area that I specialize in. But tell me a little bit about your thoughts here. What do you think when it comes to the whole role of being a jiu-jitsu content creator? Do you think that's a viable venue for people, or do you think that that's something that's maybe just too risky, too hard to make money off of?
No, I think there's absolutely money to make there. I think social media is a huge platform for a lot of people outside of jiu-jitsu anyways. So, there's absolutely money being made there. I think you're probably better off making money on social media than you would on an instructional if I had to pick one or the other.
Do you think it's oversaturated though? Because there is so much social media content out there. Do you worry that that's just a market that is just too busy? There's already too many players in the space and it's just not something that people are realistically going to succeed at? Or do you think there's still viability there for people?
There's definitely viability, but I think to go back to a lot of my strategy and a lot of things is have good structure. So know what you're trying to reach. Don't just create content for content's sake. It's like, know your audience. Like, what am I trying to do? If, for example, I'm trying to make funny videos, well, then that's what I want to make. I want to stick to the strategy and stick to the plan and see if I can reach more funny videos per se. So you just have to think to yourself, what is the content you're trying to push and whether that content has a good following. Look at your competitors, right? Just like anything else. Like if you're going to open a jiu-jitsu academy, right? You're going to look at your other competitors around and what they're doing and how they're successful. Well, the same thing is true in content. If you want to make funny videos, you say, okay, well, Craig Jones is doing a fantastic job here. Is he popular because he's good at jiu-jitsu, or is he popular because he's funny? It's probably a combination of the two. But if you notice, how much competing is he doing over the last 12 months? Not too much, but he still is popular, right? So you can say that his competitiveness gave him kind of a spring to, have more content out of there was funny or humorous. But you can also argue that people don't really care. They just want to watch his videos because they're funny. So I think a lot of it comes down to the originality of your content and what is the audience you're trying to grab and who is your competitor that you're trying to be.
Got it. Now, I can definitely add some color and some thoughts on this too, because this is something that I've worked on quite a bit, as you can imagine. I think a mistake that a lot of people make when they think about trying to monetize social media is, first of all, they think that by having a popular social media following, that means right there and there that you're going to make money. And that's just not the case, right? You can have a pretty sizable social media following and still ultimately get really nothing out of it. That's kind of one of the problems with social media, is that you have to have a really large audience before you're going to start to see any sort of big scale. There also aren't that many ways to really monetize social media. You can either rely on ads, depending on the platform you're on. You can do brand sponsorships, but you have to be pretty big before that's going to wind up being a meaningful amount of money. Like I said, that is just something that I think people need to be mindful of. I would also warn people that, of course, when you're making something on a social platform, platform, you really don't own that destination. You are there at the pleasure of YouTube or Meta or whichever company ultimately owns that service, right? So that is a meaningful distinction, because you may find one day they just decide to shut you down. You might also just find that for whatever reason, they're not prioritizing you or the type of content you make. It could be for no fault of your own. There have been a lot of cases of people whose businesses have been completely scuttled basically because they built it on top of a third party. And whenever you build your business on top of a third party that doesn't really care about whether you exist, that's always going to be a big risk. So my advice as someone who's done this is, if you're going to use social media to build your jiu-jitsu business, don't make social media your home base. That should not be the main place where you live and the main thing that you try to sell, because that's very much outside of your control and it's extraordinarily risky to do so. Make sure that you're using social media as a way to get attention and drive to another product that you do ultimately own and you can control. So to give you a very specific example, in our case, I mean, yeah, we're on social media, but everything we do on social media is intended to drive people to this podcast, which we fully control, or drive people to BJJ Mental Models Premium, which we fully control. If we made all of our money by trying to, I don't know, make YouTube videos, we could one day come in and find out that Google has decided they don't like our channel and they demonetized us. Or on Instagram, your content get flagged or removed or shadow banned, and you might never know, right? So there's always a risk in building your business on top of another company that doesn't care whether you live or die. That's just a piece of advice I would give if people want to leverage social media, is don't make it the main thing that you sell. Make it a driver that points people to the main thing that you sell. That would just be something I would suggest, having done this myself.
No, I agree with you. I would even bring that back to the original content creation for whether instructionals or whatever, right? Like, you know, we talked about BJJ fanatics before, but you've got other people out there that kind of get away from the BJJ fanatics. You've got, like, for example, you know, the Mendez brothers, they don't go through BJJ fanatics anymore. I mean, they've got AOJ Plus, right? So they have their own little platform they're using. Same thing is true with Lachlan Giles. It's like, oh, I'm not going to go through BJJ fanatics. I'll just use Meta, have my own thing, right? So there's many ways of carving this out, but I do like the strategy of you're using social media in a way to push a bigger product regardless of what platform you're using.
Yeah. Something we said on the podcast about jiu-jitsu is that when you're planning out a strategy, you want to have a solid foundation for the strategy, but a flexible perimeter. Same thing applies when you're building a business. The foundation of what you're doing has to be solid and reliable. And the issue is, if the main product you're making is an Instagram page or a YouTube channel, by definition, no matter how good your content is, it's just not going to be solid or reliable, because another company, for their own purposes, might impact your business and shut you down or significantly alter how you monetize. So that's just a piece of strategy that's just as applicable to jiu-jitsu as it is to business. So I thought it would be maybe a good idea to bring it up here.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Steve. I like that.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, hey, Greg, we've been chatting for a while here. I just wanted to ask, before we tie this up, was there anything else that you wanted to share or bring up to help people get their business off the ground, which maybe we haven't already talked about yet, or did we cover everything?
We've covered a lot of different topics. One I think that could be elaborated a little bit on is, if you are going to run an academy, I employ this. I know people talk about culture all the time and vibe of an academy, but just because we talk about it, sometimes people don't know what that really looks like, right? So I think that if you are going to do that, you need to be fully on what that looks like. You have to envision that yourself. Like, we talk about culture, but it can kind of be this, like, you know, ambiguous word. It's like a pie in the sky. It has like a lot of meaning to it. Really flesh it out. Like understand what your culture is. What is the behavior that you're trying to model? Like, what are you trying to like implement here? What do you want people to feel and see and experience when they come to your academy and interact with you and everybody else? At the end of the day, Steve, running a jiu-jitsu academy is not the technique. It really isn't. I hate saying it, but it's really not. That's just a very small part of that. People come there for one thing, but they stay for a very long time. And if you're teaching them a technique and they're going to absorb that and they're going to get good, but then they feel like this is a place they just don't want to be for a variety of reasons, they're going to go do something else. They're going to start skateboarding, or they're going to go to a different academy, or they're just going to quit altogether, right? So I think we always focus on the customer acquisition part, which is your technique and sometimes your culture, but the culture is actually what solidifies your place. And I think that that's something that I know other academy owners do talk about it, but I think we need to kind of flesh it out sometimes. If you're going to run an academy, you have to know what that looks like. Like, carve out that strategy. Say, okay, I want my academy to have this particular feel. These are the behaviors I want people to model, whatever they are, right? So like at my academy, for example, one of the core principles is that the upper belts help the lower belts, period. It doesn't matter whether you're a paying member or not. And I know that I don't force people to like help one another, but I also don't tell them that they shouldn't. I give them explanation on it. I say, well, when you first started, what was that like? Were you thankful that somebody else helped you out on day one? You were, right? So then pay it forward. It's like, when you going through a drive-through and then someone buys you a cup of coffee, what are you going to do? You're going to buy a cup of coffee for the person behind you. It's just, common courtesy, right? So is everyone going to adhere to that rule? No. But if you kind of embed that culture in people, it'll help, right? And I think that that's one of the things that I kind of try to do in my academy. That's just one small example of like a bigger pie, but I do think that academy owners really should think about when you open your place, not just the customer acquisition, but the customer retention part. That is so critical in this business because as quick as they come, as quick as they go, white belts come and they leave all the time. So your job as service industry person is to think, how do I keep my customer consistently coming in?
Yeah, it's funny. I talk about this quite a bit, and this has come up recently on the podcast, but one of the funny things about jiu-jitsu coaches is they have this weird way of looking at customer churn. They'll look at all of these white belts quitting, and they'll blame the white belts for it. They'll say, our academy has really high standards and 90% of white belts quit and those who survive will become lions and all of this stuff, right? Yeah. That's a really weird way to justify the fact that your business is hemorrhaging customers. If all of those people are leaving, it's not because you're breeding some sort of Mortal Kombat strike team of trained killers. It's because there's something wrong with your business, right? You should not have that many people dropping off that quickly. So I always do encourage business owners to change their thinking about this. It is not good or healthy if a lot of your customers are churning. That does not speak well for your ability as an instructor or the toughness of the martial art. It just means you're failing somewhere as a business owner. And I think that's always something that people need to look at is how many of my customers am I churning and am I losing? And is it my fault?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And to just add one other point to that is that I'll give you an example is, we talk about, my business and Odyssey and how like we're just this really good, very, have great culture. It's a great atmosphere. But to kind of chime on that like competitive side of it, like we're an extremely strong competitive gym. And you wouldn't kind of know that based on the people that you kind of interact with, and you see what the culture and the vibe is like and how people treat each other, and you say, wow, this seems like a very family-oriented, fun place. And then you look at our competitive rec and you go like, holy shit, like how are these guys so fucking good? So to think that you have to have one or the other is absolutely asinine to me. I will fight to the death on that. You can absolutely have an academy that is extremely talented with a lot of very good competitors and have a place that everybody else wants to be at. I think to think that these two things are mutually exclusive is silly. And I think that's, sometimes people think you have to have one or the other. You don't. You just have to have the right culture to bond the two together.
Amazing, Greg. Well, as always, thanks so much for coming by. Before we wrap up, if people want to train with you or if they want to connect with you, how can they do that?
So you can find me on Instagram at Greg Sirico is my Instagram tag. You can also find our gym or our academy. It's at Odyssey Jiu-Jitsu, just straight up Odyssey Jiu-Jitsu, ODYSSEY Jiu-Jitsu. It's OdysseyBJJ.com is our website. We're located in Atlanta, Georgia, on the west side of Atlanta, Georgia. We've got, like I said, we've got many classes. So just, if you're in the area, just come on through. Like we have like probably 5 to 7, visitors drop in like every week. So we get a lot of visitors. So anyone is welcome anytime.
Yeah, amazing, man. Well, again, thanks so much. I'll put those links in the show notes. So if people want to contact Greg or train with him, just open up your podcast player, go to the show notes, and you'll find some links there that you can click. I'll also put a link to BJJ Mental Models. Our stuff is in there as well. You probably already know this, but everything we make is at bjjmentalmodels.com. That includes the podcast, that includes the newsletter, the concept database, everything's on there, and all of that stuff is free. If you want to kick jiu-jitsu up to the next level, that's what BJJ Mental Models Premium is for. It's also how we support the podcast here and fund this thing. That's where you can get, as I talked about earlier, a giant library of audio masterclasses from people who really are domain specialists in the area. So specifically, like you talked about earlier, Greg, if you're a gym owner, if you're a business person in the sport, if you're just looking for good, strong technical concepts and strategies for jiu-jitsu, we've got a whole audio library for you there. there with over 50 hours of stuff on there. I always do recommend that people check it out, and there's a free trial so you can cancel anytime. Beyond the audio library, if you sign up, you're also going to get direct coaching from our Black Belt review team, featuring some of the best in the world, including Brianna St. Marie, among others. And you also get to be part of our awesome Discord community. So again, all of that is at bjjmentalmodels.com. And I always ask, if you haven't already checked that out, please do so. Really helps the show. And by all accounts, it really helps the people who sign up there as well. But again, thanks a lot, Greg, man. I really appreciate it. This was a fun one. Can't tell you enough how much I appreciate you coming by here.
Same, Steve. This is awesome.
Awesome. All right. Thanks a lot, buddy. And thanks to the listeners too. Always appreciate it. And we'll talk to you next time. See you soon.